Okay, we're on Facebook. All right, here we go.
The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everyone. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Puerto Rico beautiful Saturday. I'm really excited about the show today. We're going to be talking about socialism and how it sucks. And we're going to do that with a friend, a colleague that, you know, we bump into each other all over the world, Georgia, China, Ukraine, places like that. Robert Lawson, who's a professor of economics at SMU in Dallas, and is the author, other than Capitalism Sucks, is the author of the Economic Freedom Index, and we'll be talking about that as well. So thanks for joining me, Bob.
Hey, Yaron, good to be here.
So I use the Economic Freedom Index quite a bit, and I know a lot of those of us who advocate for free markets out there use it. But there's always this question of, you know, first tell us who publishes it, where people can find it, and then we'll get into a little bit into how it's calculated and what it means.
Yeah, sure. So I was the founding co-author with Jim Gortney and Walter Block originally. It's published by the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian think tank, kind of like Cato, I guess, or Heritage in Canada. We started this project back in the early 90s. And we just wanted to try to cobble together some kind of quantitative measurement of economic freedom, or free markets, capitalism, laissez-faire, whatever term of art you want to use. And we wanted to try to put a number on it for a large number of countries. And the hope, and I think it's been pretty successful, the hope is that by putting a number on it, we might focus our debate just a little bit more than what had gone on before we had those kind of numbers to look at.
So when you look at economic freedom, what are the parameters you look at, and how do you weight them? Because that seems to be, strikes me, that could be quite subjective in terms of how you weight the different parameters.
Yeah, so there's a lot of technical details. I mean, we're basically a data-driven index. That is to say, we collect data that already exists from, you know, frankly, socialist organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and even the UN, but also some private groups like the World Economic Forum, PricewaterhouseCoopers collects some tax data and stuff for their clients, and we grab those numbers. So we just collect data on everything from government spending and taxation to property rights. Now, the property rights measures get a little subjective because they're really hard to measure how clean and efficient court systems are at enforcing property rights. We measure like monetary stability, which is pretty easy with monetary and inflation type numbers. Free trade, you know, tariff numbers from the WTO, other sorts of capital controls from the IMF. And then we've got a whole big area on regulations where we measure a bunch of kind of a hodgepodge of different types of regulations. We can't capture all the regulations in the world. So we just sort of try to collect the big ones, like the minimum wage, which, you know, most countries have in one way or another, and things like that. We throw all these numbers into the computer, just basically algebra to convert everything to index numbers. And the low tech side of it is it's just a big average. So we don't really weight the numbers too much. We just sort of throw them in and take an average.
Okay.
And the reason is we really don't know what the weighting, you know, it's not like Moses didn't come down from Mount Sinai with a list of weights for an economic freedom index. So we just sort of throw it in and hope for the best. We do publish the whole thing and the spreadsheet. So we have had scholars who have disagreed with our weights.
Okay.
And that maybe something should be dropped out and have zero weight or what have you. And we're like, hey, fine, you know, here's the index. You can come out with your own version of it, and that's fine with us. We don't claim that this is high science.
Yeah.
We do like to think that it adds something of value to the conversation, but it's not pure. It's not like nuclear physics.
And where can somebody find like the actual report and the spreadsheet?
Yeah, the Fraser Institute has a website. The easiest way is a website URL called freetheworld.com. Okay. It actually redirects to another website, but Free the World's relatively easy to remember. And if you go there, you can download the entire report, PowerPoints, the data. And it's not just the economic freedom of the world. There's also an economic freedom of North America, which has an index for the 50 US states, I think 9 Canadian provinces, and maybe 15 Mexican states. So there's sort of subnational economic freedom indexes that you can get on that same website.
Yeah, I wish policymakers used it more to move up on that index. But
yes, some do. Unfortunately, ours don't.
Yeah, certainly don't. I want to get to the U.S., where the U.S. is ranked in a minute. What is, so 100? If a country's really free in terms of no regulations, a flat or very low tax, could it get to 100? I mean, is that a mathematical possibility in your index?
Well, I mean, the reality is it's all relative. We actually end up grading on the curve. Okay. So we use a 10-point scale. So a 10 would only mean that you were sort of the best among the rest. And so Hong Kong, for example, gets a 9 out of 10 on our scale, and they're the #1 rated country or economy. We don't need to debate whether they're a country right now. But they're 9 out of 10. But by no means does that mean they're the sort of capitalist country that I would prefer. It just means that they're the best.
Yeah. They're 90% there.
They're 90% of the best practice. Basically, it's the 90% of the best practices in basically 1990 is the year we anchored everything to.
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
if you were the best in every category in 1990, you would have gotten a 10 across the board. No one was the best in every category. So, yeah. But Hong Kong is basically 90% as good as we've ever seen, around the world.
Yeah. So where does the U.S. rank?
Well, currently the U.S. is 5th, and there's been a lot of transition there. So we have numbers back to 1970, and for every year from 70 to 2000, it was Hong Kong 1, Singapore 2, and the U.S. was 3. And it was, you could just lock that in. Every year I'd put the numbers in, 1, 2, 3, Hong Kong, Singapore, U.S. And then in 2000, and we have annual data starting in 2000 also, the numbers began to fall for the United States. And in a rating sense, the U.S. score went from about an 8.5 down to about a 7.7. Wow. Which is a large decrease in our scale of things. I mean, it's a letter grade decrease. It's like going from an A to a B if you're a college professor, and it kept going down every year from 2001, 2002, and I really attribute most of this to the reaction to 9/11. The war on terrorism not only was a big increase in government spending, which it absolutely was, it was also a pretty big regulatory shock to our system. A lot of capital controls and financial regulations were added nominally to fight terrorism. And whether those were good policies is perhaps a secondary debate, but there are absolutely restrictions on economic freedom.
Yes.
So that was the first hit. And then the second hit, of course, was the financial crisis. And we all know the reaction to the financial crisis was a huge hit.
Yeah.
And then, so we went down to as low as 16th ranking wise. And it's kind of crept back up. I mean, at the end of Obama's administration, and to a certain extent, even under the current administration, fiscal matters they certainly haven't improved dramatically, but at least they've stopped falling. And the regulatory world has stabilized a little bit. So the ranking and the rating have crept a little bit back up. We're 5th right now.
So it was a big part of the increase actually in Obama's second term? Is that right?
Yeah, it actually began. I mean, we're always 2 years delayed. So I've only, like right now, I just finished the 2017 data. So we're always lagged quite a bit. But we did see the rebound begin sort of in the second half, or maybe even the second quarter, the last 3 years of Obama's administration.
Yeah, I think as they have those budget spending constraints, which now are gone. So
yeah,
I
absolutely.
wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. dropped in the next 2 years, given the increase in spending and tariffs.
I think that both of those are clearly going to trend downward. Now, the regulatory improvements might offset a little bit, but I'm with you. If I was betting, and I don't usually try to prognosticate on these numbers. I just put them in the computer. But if I was betting, I'd probably guess that the spending and tariff side of things is going to dominate. We should see some decreases.
So we're going to talk about the book, and we're going to go through these countries. I want to see where these countries fall in terms of the ones you have numbers for, where they fall relative to the United States and relative to the index, because I think that's interesting. So tell us a little bit about the book. This is Capitalism Sucks. By the way, you can all get the book on
That's Socialism Sucks.
Socialism Sucks. Jesus. What did I say? You can get the book on. I'm not going to hear the end of this on social media. This is it. You guys can get the book on Amazon. There's a link in the description below the video, both on Facebook and on YouTube. And so tell us. I mean, I finished the book about a week ago. I listened to it on Audible, and I just found it was an easy read, a quick read, and very enjoyable. So it was a really, really enjoyable read. But how did this whole idea come about?
Well, thanks. It's nice to hear that. So Mike, the full title of the book is Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World. And my co-author is Ben Powell. And Ben, I know you know, is a professor at Texas Tech University. He runs something called the Free Market Institute. And I run a center in the business school at SMU, a free market center myself. And, without bragging, we're pretty accomplished academics. We have easily 200 journal articles between us, books, articles. We're reasonably well known in our little circles. But let's be honest, when I finish a journal article, I'm pretty sure like 10 people read it and 8 of them were my friends. And we kind of got to the point in our careers where we have the money to travel, the time to travel, and also the career flexibility to write a book that was about something we care about, which is capitalism and socialism and why socialism sucks. But if you're going to write a book that actual people are going to read, you can't write a boring journal article.
Yep.
So we decided to hit the road, and we read Anthony Bourdain and P.G. O'Rourke and said, let's write like those guys, but let's try to have the content of Milton Friedman. So we sometimes describe this as the bastard stepchild of Anthony Bourdain and Milton Friedman's book. Because we wanted to write in a way that people would find was funny. Now it is a deadly serious topic. I mean, literally a deadly serious topic. Yep. But there's no reason why we can't travel to Cuba and Venezuela and China and have fun while we do it, drink a lot of beer, but tell a sort of a man on the street story, kind of combining what we saw on the streets of say Havana with what we know about economics from our professorial lives.
Yeah, and just to give some credibility to this idea that they drank their way through these countries, we attend many conferences together, whether it's Mont Pelerin or APPE, which is the Association of Private Enterprise Educators, which is a free market academic conference. Ben and Bob are always among the last to leave the bar. And, I don't drink much. And these guys it's amazing their capacity to drink. So, and the book documents that geographically. So you literally, traveled around the world and went to these socialist and not so socialist countries and went to bars and experienced kind of day-to-day the way life is in these countries. I noticed that when you went to Cuba that you didn't go to the touristy,
that's right,
high-end kind of resort hotels. You went to real Cuban hotels.
Yeah. We didn't want to, we weren't sandbagging it. We weren't like living in the streets, but there's no point in going to Cuba and going and staying in the Hotel Nacional. I mean, the Hotel Nacional is a 5-star international hotel that diplomats stay in, and we didn't even bother to go over. I'm sure it's glorious. Everyone says it's nice. We stayed our first night in Havana. We stayed at the Hotel Caribe, which is described as a 3-star hotel. Well, let's just say Cuban 3 stars are different than American 3 stars. We did have 3 of the 4 elevators didn't work. There was mold all over the shower. We had water 1 of the 2 days we were there. That was nice. It was literally one of the worst places I've ever stayed in. It's a government-run hotel, and you know, this is no surprise to you or most of your viewers or listeners. You know, if you try to operate a hotel that shabbily in the United States, you'd be out of business in a week. No one would stay there. But you know, that's a government-run hotel. They're not going out of business. If they don't make ends meet, the government will cover any losses, and it's a powerful disincentive to do a good job. So, I mean, it was actually a better hotel than the other government hotel, which was another night. There, they were kind enough to give us soap, although it was the soap left over from the previous guests. So,
okay. So it's so let's define the terms, because you do this in the book, and so many, I do debates all the time, capitalism, socialism debates with socialists, and the one thing they never do is define what they're talking about, because they want to hide what the real meaning of it. Plus, they want to take credit for Sweden, which we'll get to in a minute. So, when you talk about socialism, what is it you're talking about?
Yeah, so we actually use Sweden as our exemplar there, and the title of that chapter, it's the first chapter, is Not Socialism. And one of the tells, in fact, we used beer became kind of a running. It's not just that Ben and I like beer. Beer became kind of a running metaphor through the book for the entire economy. And the first tell that Sweden is not socialist is that the beer is good. Yep. There's a picture of us drinking at Duval Cafe, drinking Belgian Duval beer. And it was good and cold. Now, it was very, very expensive. And that's a tell that you're not in a free market country, because that beer shouldn't be that expensive. But that bar we were drinking in was a private bar. There are no central planners deciding what Swedish companies produce and how they produce them. They're not allocating labor and capital and raw materials to businesses. There's no central plan. Volvo is a private firm. They sell their cars all over the world at you know, market prices. So Sweden is not a socialist country the way we define it. We define it as collective, and that de facto means state control of the means of production, that the state is going to make the decisions about what gets produced, how those things get produced, and ultimately even for whom, how people consume them. And that's not the way the Swedish economy works. It's a market economy. Now, they nail you on tax day, as you know.
Yep.
Their taxes are 50% at least higher than the United States. And that's why that beer was so expensive. But that was good, privately made capitalist beer that was very highly taxed. And we want to distinguish sort of high tax welfare states from socialism. And a lot of people do confuse those things today on both the left and the right. Friends of ours on what we sometimes call the right. I hate that term, but there it is.
I do too.
But you know, friends of ours will sometimes call Sweden socialist, and that's just not accurate. Yep. And then you have Bernie Sanders on the left today calling them socialist too. And some people are just misinformed, and we can talk about how some of the young people today are misinformed about what socialism is. But some people are also lying. I mean, Bernie Sanders, I think, is a liar. I mean, he knows what socialism is. I mean, he went to the Soviet Union for his honeymoon. Also, who does that? But anyway, my wife would have murdered me. Hey, honey, we're going to the Soviet Union for our honeymoon.
It takes real dedication. Real dedication.
You got to be a hard comrade to do that. But I mean, so Bernie knows what socialism is. He went there, he saw it up close and personal, and he liked it.
Yep.
So for him today to say, well, what I really mean is Denmark or Sweden is more than disingenuous. But leaving him aside, most young people today, when they say they want to be socialists like Sweden, it's not that they're lying cheats like Bernie. They just think that socialism means high taxes and some more government spending. And we wanted to distinguish that in the book. And so we're talking about real socialism, the kind of socialism that was practiced in the Soviet Union and Mao's China, that is currently practiced in North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. Yep. That's what we're talking about.
So, you know, where does Sweden rank on the Economic Freedom Index?
Yeah, so you know, that's a great way to look at it. And you know, the Economic Freedom Index essentially is a scale from socialism on the one end to capitalism on the other, as close as we get capitalism in the world. And when we wrote the book, Sweden was 27. I think they're like 36th right now, but there's 160 countries. So they're in the top quarter or the top third of the whole world. Yeah, they're not as market oriented or capitalist as Hong Kong or even the United States, but you know, they're nowhere near the socialist economies like the Venezuela. Venezuela is dead last. They're 162 out of 162. That's actual socialism. And so the index is a good way to distinguish on a sort of a continuous scale where you are, and they're more on the capitalist side, very much more on the capitalist side than the socialist side of things.
And they probably get hit on the economic index on the taxes and the redistribution.
It's the spending mostly, and also labor market policies. But generally speaking, the property rights scores are better than the U.S.'s. The monetary and trade scores are comparable, and regulatory measures in Sweden are actually pretty good too, except for labor markets.
Yep.
Like if you were running a business in Stockholm, you would find it to be an easier regulatory environment than most American businesses would. Again, except for the hiring and firing of workers part.
And I'm not even sure there if they're worse than California.
That's probably true.
It has really bad hiring and firing regulations. So even within the U.S., there's huge variations around these things. How do you treat in the index? How do you treat socialized medicine, for example, in the index?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, so if it runs through the government, like in England or Canada, I mean, it's government spending. That's all it is. So we just count it as government spending. To the extent they're rationing it and the prices don't make sense, as you know, it gets hard to measure these things. But we're measuring it as spending, and that's the reality of it. Now, one of the challenges is like a mandate, like Obamacare, where you basically force people to buy private insurance. Yeah, we would unfortunately not really capture that. That's such a peculiar, idiosyncratic regulation that our index would be silent to that. And that's a defect of the index. But that's the reality of it. Same thing with like Social Security. If the Social Security pension program runs through the government, we get it. But if it's a forced savings plan like Chile's or something, which is, we're going to miss that. It's outside the budget.
Okay. Well, at least it gives Chile. I mean, since it's a slight move towards freedom, then it's a little better.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are basically no countries that don't have some system. So it's the best system probably is theirs.
Yeah. So you went from a cold, really good Belgian beer in Sweden to Venezuela.
Yeah, actually, I've got a Venezuelan Polar right here. I'll take a little drink of this.
Are you sure you want to do that?
It's really terrible. This was actually manufactured. This was brewed in Miami.
Oh.
This is Polar. This is a Venezuelan firm. It's actually easier to get in Miami. They've actually had times in the last few years where the Polar company couldn't manufacture beer in Venezuela. It's not clear that they ever ran out for the country, but the factories had to shut down. And the reason is the Venezuelan economy, as we all know, is turned socialist. And one aspect of that in Venezuela is that they control the foreign exchange system. Mm-hmm. And so all foreign exchange transactions legally speaking, have to go through the government. And the government bureaucrats that are in charge of that didn't give Polar enough dollars to import barley. They don't grow barley in Venezuela, so they have to import it. And obviously barley growers in America or Canada or wherever they get barley, they expect to be paid in dollars.
Sure.
And so if they don't get enough barley, they don't make beer. So they've actually had beer shortages in Venezuela. Socialism sucks. If I was running a socialist country, I'd do no better at it than the Venezuelans.
Yeah.
But I would make sure they made beer. I mean, if everything else would go to hell in a handbasket, I'm sure, but at least we would have beer. Even the Soviets, knew that it was bad beer and bad vodka or whatever, but even they had it.
Well, to some extent, you want that because you have to, at least it dulls the senses, right? It dulls the pain
absolutely.
Of having to live under the poverty of. I have to say, though, I grew up in Israel, and Israel, when I was growing up, was quite socialist. Yeah. The largest employer in Israel was the labor union. The labor union was the largest employer, so it owned the means of production. The labor union did, and it's why Israel was relatively a poor country back then. And I don't think there was any good alcohol in Israel in those days. So
there is now. I've been to wonderful brew bar pubs and wine.
Israel's not a socialist country anymore. You go there and you can see it immediately.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Right. Yeah, so the beer became a metaphor in Venezuela. The beer, you can get it, although it's easier to get here. It's not very good, but it's by far, it's not the worst beer I've ever had. Maybe we'll talk about the worst beer I've ever had in a minute. That's North Korea. But so we went to, in Venezuela, we went to the Colombian border, a little town called Cucuta. And if you've watched the news stories about Venezuela, you've probably seen these bridges, these two bridge crossings between Colombia and Venezuela. And when we were there, this was about 2 years ago, literally, without exaggeration, thousands over the course of a day, easily 10,000 people are crossing from Venezuela to buy rice and beans and sugar and deodorant.
Where do they get the currency to do that? Are they?
Well, so that was the funny thing. They do bring in Venezuelan money. In fact, when they come into the country, they're lugging like luggage, like airport, like on wheels, like we would have at an airport. And you could see these people with very heavy bags coming into Venezuela. And at first, this was confusing to us. We were like, why are their bags heavy? We understand why they're heavy going out. They have the rice and the beans. But it turns out they're heavy on the way in because they're bringing in literally suitcases full of bolivars.
Wow.
And then they trade entire stacks or suitcases. They don't even count the money. They weigh it at the money changers. And so you trade a suitcase of bolivars for a small amount of pesos, yep. And then you buy your food and things with that. So,
Colombians must have some kind of exchange ability to turn it back.
Yeah, so they're probably very quickly flipping it as quickly as they can back in, probably at the official exchange rate. So I mean, there's probably an arbitrage profit that they're getting on that too, because the official exchange rate's obviously terrible. So that's where we went, and it was not the normal kind of poverty. I know you've traveled a lot. I've seen some of the world's greatest poverty, and I never want to get used to it. Like, you should always find poverty like shocking.
Yep.
But this was not that. These were middle class, even people that even looked rich, who were coming and crossing to buy food. We talked to one couple we talk about in the book, Paulo and Ana Maria. They had come 3 days one way. So it was a 6-day round trip from the other side of Venezuela. They'd driven all the way across the country to Colombia. And he worked in a hotel. He was a middle class, just a regular Joe. And he was doing a 6-day round trip, and he left his child behind with family. I just can't imagine how dystopic my existence would be. I live in Dallas. I mean, I guess what would it be like to have to drive to Vancouver for groceries and leave my child behind in a dangerous country? It really was worse in many ways than the slums of India that I've seen, because when you see regular people who are not peasants, and I care about the peasants too. I don't want to make this sound like I don't, but this was a whole nother level of despair that I'd never seen with my own eyes before.
Well, I've been told by people from Caracas that, you've got middle-class kids, or even the kids of the wealthy, dumpster diving for food. I mean, because that's the only place they can find just a little bit of food, eating pets and eating all the zoo animals. And one can only just imagine, unfortunately, what life must be like for the poor in Venezuela. I mean, if this is what the middle class
these people had the means. They had a car. They had the means to drive across the country. I mean, most Venezuelans don't. So
a lot of people are claiming, Venezuela is not really socialist. There's still private property in Venezuela, all this stuff. But when I look at the numbers, I mean, they really did collectivize farming. And they really did collectivize the whole supply chain in oil.
Yeah.
What else is obviously kind of socialist about what's going on in Venezuela?
Yeah. I mean, when you collectivize farms, that means you're collectivizing the supply chain for food too, which, and then the supply chain and the food for energy. These are the two most critical things to our existence. Food and warmth in the winter and cool in the summer, and heat for our food. So they collectivize it. So yeah, sure. Little stores on the streets are still privately owned, but you even had that in the Soviet Union. I mean, no country has completely socialized all aspects of the means of production. But Venezuela has gone about 80% down that road, and they haven't gone down as far probably as Mao's China did during the Great Leap Forward, but it's 80% of the way there. It's about as socialized as any country's gotten. I mean, it's as socialized as Cuba. Cuba has some private enterprise, and so. But when you're talking about controlling those types of sectors, food and energy and finance, capital markets, completely controlled by the government. I mentioned foreign exchange, but the banking system is also collectivized. So, yeah, you can give people a little bit of freedom to buy and sell stuff on the streets, but and that's a nice thing. I mean, it's better than collectivizing, street level vendors, but it's a recipe for ruining the country, and we've certainly seen that. But I have no trouble calling Venezuela a socialist country. I mean,
and it's stunning to me because, again, I think people have to lie to do this. I'm not saying all students are doing that, because I think a lot of them are truly ignorant. But anybody with any kind of education, anybody who knows anything really about Venezuela, who claims Venezuela is not socialist, is just nuts.
Yeah.
And is lying. It really is.
They've nationalized hotels too. I mean, so it's gotten to the point where the government is controlling not just the major factors. They're getting into the point where they're controlling things as trivial, frankly, as hotels.
So Cuba, you mentioned the hotels in Cuba. I did a debate in England, socialism, capitalism, and we were both asked what would be the ideal country based on your system. And, we each kind of said, well, there's no country in the world today that really gets there. And then the socialist says, he went first. And then he said, but if I had to pick my ideal country, he'd say Cuba. And I almost fell off my chair because I didn't think anybody could be that dishonest or not so crazy or whatever you want to call it. So don't they have great healthcare in Cuba? And can everybody read? And isn't that what's really important in life?
Sure, I guess. I mean, if I was choosing the best socialist country, I'd pick Cuba. It's the title of that chapter is Subsistence Socialism. And Cuba's surviving. They're not starving in the streets. People aren't making 3-day
not North Korea
trips to get food. It's not dystopia completely. It's quite lively and fun and energetic. Yeah, if you do want to go to the hospital, unless you're going to a tourist hospital, better bring your own sheets and aspirin. And the care is free, but you would not want that care. And we almost titled the chapter on Cuba, "The Price is Wrong," kind of a play on the old game show, because that's also a hallmark of socialist economies, is that when they take over the means of production, they also end up controlling the price system de facto, or either directly by setting prices or de facto by regulating quantities. And everything is just mispriced in Cuba. Things just don't make sense. You and I know that when you travel and you go to a very nice hotel and there's a balcony or maybe a patio overlooking an old colonial square, we all know that's going to be a $5 cup of coffee, sure, and a $12 mojito. And you go to Cuba and it turns out the price of the coffee or the mojito is the same price in the fancy, sure, hotel as it is some alley street, where there's 3, cats laying under your chair. So prices don't work in the same way in Cuba. We ended up staying in nicer or eating in nicer restaurants, because when the nice restaurant prices are the same as the sort of not nice ones, so you might as well go to the nice one. So the prices don't make sense, and it's hard to navigate. When and we were just visitors there for a week. It's hard to make choices rationally when you don't have those price signals, and you don't really realize it until you don't have those price signals. And so that's strange. I mean, but the stores don't have them either. I mean, the product mixes are the most bizarre experience. I mean, you're in Puerto Rico. I'm sure if you go to a tienda in Puerto Rico, you would see, an array of products, but different types of colas and waters and sparkling waters and candies. You go to a Cuban, the equivalent of a 7-Eleven, a little store, and it'll be stocked. So it's not like Venezuela. There's actually stuff to buy, but the entire store might have 15 or 20 items. There's a wall of Coca-Cola. Well, Ben called it Kami-Cola because it wasn't Coca-Cola. It was whatever they make. Yep. And there's only one kind, though. Yeah. And there's 2 types of beer. The Cuban central planners do authorize 2 types. They're both bad, but so you have some variety in beer. But of course, you go into the poorest neighborhood in Dominican Republic, you're going to see 40 different types of beer. It doesn't matter how poor. It's not a function of poverty. This is a function of socialism. And we wanted to really try to distinguish poverty, which again is a separate problem we really should work on and care about, from socialism, because they're different. And there's just no excuse for the lack of variety in the Cuban economy. If you ever go to Cuba, my advice is to bring salt, because the Cuban government doesn't provide salt at all. And if you've ever gone a few days without salt, it's beyond awful. You don't even realize how important that is in your life until you don't have it.
So one of the nice things about the book is you kind of integrate these economic principles into the stories. So you have sections on you know, the importance of pricing and the importance of the price signal. So people reading this will not just get a sense of these countries and a sense of what they're like, but also a little bit of education, kind of Econ 101 kind of education, and free market Econ 101, not the usual nonsense that is taught in Econ 101. Integrated into those stories. And I think it makes the book all that more interesting and powerful, meaningful. So Cuba, you visited Cuba, you got to go there. You didn't really get to visit North Korea. You just got to experience it from kind of a distance.
Yeah, so we did go to South Korea. We wanted to draw the contrast between North and South Korea, and we went to Seoul. In fact, you were at the Mulpellery meeting in Seoul at the same time we were. And but then you can go to North Korea, but for Ben and me, Ben runs a free market institute. I run a free market institute. I mean,
not a good idea.
Yeah, even if they let us in, it's not obvious they'd let us out. And you know, we just had an young American tourist, some kind of Christian missionary. He got murdered. So I want to write a book, but I don't want to die over it. So we went to Dandong, China. Now, unlike the DMZ with the border with South Korea, you can't see anything. It's 10 miles wide or something, 6 miles wide. We went to Dandong, China, on the northern North Korea border. It's the major city where transactions occur between North Korea and China. And Dandong is a modern Chinese city. It's not Shanghai or Beijing by any means, but it's a modern, capitalist-looking city. The skyline is just miles and miles of skyscrapers. I'm sure you've seen the satellite photo of the Korean Peninsula, and it's all dark in North Korea, and you can see all the lights in South Korea. But if you look at the northern North Korea border there, you can really see Dandong. It's a big, bright spot on the satellite map. And we went there, and that satellite photo is not a Photoshop. When we arrived, it was dark. We landed like at 8 o'clock at night, and it was evening. And we got to our hotel. We were like, North Korea is right across the river. It was so exciting. It's right there. And we go to the river, and there's nothing. We can't see anything. It's complete blackness. Now, we thought there was a city over there, a North Korean city. And in the morning when we woke up, sure enough, there is a city over there. Mm-hmm. You see mid-rise buildings, no high rises, but you see plenty of buildings and people on the North Korean side working the docks and farmers and fields. But it was complete pitch black darkness at night. That satellite photo is not some right-wing propaganda. That's literally what it looks like at night in North Korea.
So I want to talk a little bit about China, because China is kind of an interesting case, because where is it in the Economic Freedom Index? It must be very low.
Yeah, it is low. It's obviously, I don't have a score for Mao's China. Mao's China on a scale of 10 would have been a 1. I mean, 0.5 or something. In our scale right now, they're like 5.5 or 6 on the 10-point scale. Their ranking is like 110th out of 160. It's by no means, and certainly parts of China, like Shenzhen, are probably as economically free as say, Hong Kong even. But as a whole, China doesn't score very well. It's still a very tightly government-controlled economy. The capital markets are completely government-controlled, banking system. They have authorized private property, but it's still what capitalism exists in China is crony capitalism, and crony capitalism is better than socialism, but and we should give in China some credit for that.
Yeah, but I hate the term crony capitalism. Just
I know. Yeah, I do too, actually. So they don't score very well. But
so how do we expel the wealth creation? Because that's always kind of a mystery. We always say there's a high correlation between economic freedom and wealth creation, and China seems, I don't think really does, seems to contradict that, because we've seen massive amounts of wealth creation, but by conventional measures, at least, there's no economic freedom there.
Well, I mean, so for one thing, I think when it comes to growth, and China's grown from, let's say, $1,000 per person to maybe $10,000 per person, something like that. That's an incredible growth rate to go. That's a tenfold increase in incomes, and we know it's just lifted literally hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty into something like a dignified life. It's a great thing, and that's what you get if you just let off take your foot off the neck of people just a little bit. They will rise up and prosper all by themselves. So I think a lot of it is just getting out of Mao's hard socialism to something like what we see today is enough to get you a lot of progress. Now, I don't think China is going to go from 10,000 or wherever it is today to $30,000, $40,000 per person, like the kind of standards of living that we enjoy in the US or in Europe. That's going to require actual something more like real capitalism. But just not actually trying to keep people down is all it takes. And so I think that's the first thing. And the other thing is, the parts of China that are growing the most are the ones that have liberalized the most. And so the growth hasn't been uniform. It's been concentrated in those special economic zones in the cities where that has happened. And those places are approaching, the liberalness of Europe or the US. Not in every, from an economic perspective. And we know that's not true across the board, though.
Yeah, and I think that's important because it is the growth in the Shenzhen and Shanghai and places like that. Because I've been in rural China, and rural China is still unbelievably poor, and it's still kind of sad. But it's also empty of people because so many people have left. And these cities, I remember the first time I was in Dongguan, I think in 2004 or 5. Dongguan, there was nobody there in 85, 86. And now it's got, in 2004, it had 8 to 10 million people already. I mean, it's in close to Shenzhen. It's in that Guangzhou area where it's relatively free. That's where the economic progress has really happened. And one of the reasons people on the right, that term I hate, but people on the more conservative, conventional right, afraid of China, right? Because China's going to get rich. It's going to become richer than America. And it's going to have this army and it's going to conquer the world. And my view is, as long as they stay authoritarian, they can't get to the 30, 40,000 per capita. And that's what rich means. And if they free up, then who cares if they become rich? Then it's a win-win for everybody if they actually free up. So the correlation between freedom and prosperity still has not been broken.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no question about it. Unfortunately, China's political system is still hotly, repressive. And you and I think you especially found that out firsthand. We attended a meeting with you in Beijing. Ben and I were there for our book, and frankly, no offense, we didn't want to spend the entire time with you guys. We just dropped in at the end of it one day for this just delightful little conference that you helped organize with the Uniroyal Institute, I think, on Ayn Rand and Hayek. And it was a wonderful thing to be in Beijing with Chinese scholars and talking about the ideas of Rand and Hayek. And well, of course, I think firsthand what happened the next morning when the government shut the meeting down. And we had already left, but
what actually happened is we had moved. So we were supposed to hold a meeting at a university, and at the university where many of the scholars came from. And the university called a call that day saying you cannot do it at the university, and they shut it down at the university. And they said the scholars are not allowed to attend even if you do it elsewhere. So we actually moved the event to a hotel, and some of the scholars, one of the things that's really sad about China is these scholars that you've met, I've met, they're courageous people. We have it easy, right? We combat students and other professors in our universities. These people have Secret Service people following them around and watching them, and they could go to jail at any moment. Some of them have sat in jail on several occasions and are being interrogated by the police there. So it's really a horrible situation they live under. But many of them came to the event in spite of that. At the same time as we ran the event at the hotel, the officers of Uniroyal, where were attacked, and a bunch of thugs that were hired by governments shut them down. And since then, I don't know if you saw in the New York Times a few weeks ago, there was a story that they've shut down the institute. They go completely out of business. And You know, it's so sad because these people, many of them 2 years ago, they were already a little pessimistic. But I'd say 5, 6 years ago, they were so optimistic about the direction China was going to head in politically, not just economically. And it's tragic to see really what happened there and what's going on there. So yeah, you know, I don't think China's going to get much richer unless it opens up, frees up, and changes course. And unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
I mean, sometimes scholars call this the middle income trap. I mean, you can get to middle income just, you know, basically just let some markets work. You'll get to middle income just, you know, on autopilot. But you want to get to actual, you know, the innovation economies that we live in, that requires actual economic freedom. So, I mean, I'm willing to applaud countries, you know, getting to middle income. That's good for those people, but
absolutely,
it's not going to happen. And
even we don't have real economic freedom.
Absolutely.
So you can imagine how rich we would be.
Absolutely.
And the kind of innovation and technology we would have if we had real economic freedom. So I'm going to skip Russia and Ukraine, although you didn't spend a lot of time much in the book on Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, Russia is, again, a very, very mixed case where there's clearly more freedom than there was under the Soviet Union, but it's still pretty oppressive. And I've been in Moscow, and you kind of feel it a little bit in the Red Square. And I went to the mall in Moscow. I don't know if you saw this. And people are getting photographed with somebody dressed up like Stalin. And as if this is a celebrity and that they're worshiping. It's just, you know, Russia and Ukraine are sad countries, I find.
Yeah, they are. They are. And you're right. There wasn't, by the time we got to that point in the book, there wasn't much more we could say. I mean, it was sort of like China again. Well, it's not as bad as it used to be. But boy, this is such a squandered opportunity when you know, the cronyism that these places are just being run by they're private kleptocrats now. I mean, you know, but they're not commissars, but they almost just changed the letterhead. And I guess that's good. There's no KGB knocking on your door at 2 a.m. in the morning for the most part.
Yep.
But yeah, it's not so great.
But you end the book in one of my favorite places. I know we have common friends in Georgia. I discovered it a lot after you did, so I only in the last few years, but I keep going back because they're such amazing people and they're so friendly, and the place is so, I find it really beautiful and interesting. And that's Georgia, Tbilisi and the country of Georgia. And Georgia went through this period, unfortunately it was short, where it had these really radical economic reforms that they really made a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Economic Freedom Index, Georgia is, I think, 12th in the most recent report. So, I mean, it's just almost unimaginable. This was a Soviet republic as of 1991. So within a generation, they've gone from whatever the Soviet Republic of Georgia would have scored, which I don't know, 2, to a score now around 8 out of 10. They've been in the top 10. It's amazing. And the reforms that they did after the Rose Revolution with, I'm sure, our mutual friend Kaha Bendikidze, may he rest in peace, it was just nothing short of amazing. I mean, it is the advantage of being a small country. I mean, I like to joke with my Georgian friends that my city is larger than their country, and it's actually twice as large as their country. So it helps to be a small country where you can really mobilize the intellectual currents in your favor. You can't do it forever, obviously, but man, it's amazing. They went from 40-50% tax rates to a flat across-the-board tax rate, including like Social Security tax rate is 20%. Mm-hmm. That's all. That's it. They have no tariffs. They fired 30,000 police officers in one day, and crime went down.
A few weeks without any police officers because they were training the new one, and they went from one of the most corrupt police forces anywhere in the world to today. There's no corruption in the police.
The crime went down because the cops were the criminals. So you know. So, I mean, it's actually hard to overstate how radical and fast the free market reforms were in Georgia. And the Georgian economy has responded very nicely. Now, they're not very rich, but they've more than doubled or tripled their income per person. And, you know, I think that if they stay the course, you know, they're 10, 15 years, they're going to wake up quite wealthy.
And they've got the real challenge of being, in a sense, in a state of war with Russia, which means they have to spend money on that, but also just enemy and people leave because there's always that threat that Russia might do something. So it's a real tragedy in that sense.
Yeah, I was actually in Georgia when the Russian war happened in August of 2008. And so, and it is sort of an existential threat. And you can imagine the effect that has on international capital flows. I mean, if I was a foreign investor with the risk of a Georgia-Russia conflict at almost any time, but despite that, they've still been able to grow at 4, 5, 6% a year. And that's what's been fantastic.
And, what's inspiring there is, as you point out in the book, it was really one guy, right? I mean, there were a lot of supporting characters, but it was one guy. I never met Kaha, unfortunately. I've met his daughter, who now runs the university he founded in Tbilisi, a free university, and she's wonderful. But Kaha was a larger than life character from all the stories I hear, and
he was literally larger than life.
Yeah, big guy.
Big guy.
And he lived big because, I mean, even the stories the daughter tells, that she didn't know he was his daughter for many, many years. But he basically dragged a lot of people kicking and screaming to these reforms, and kind of took a president who was generally sympathetic, but not going to really go out on a limb for this. He really got these reforms done, and it shows the power of a character like that who had intellectual conviction. I mean, he'd studied these ideas, the ideas of markets, and he really believed them, and he put them into action. Yeah,
I mean, without exaggeration, he's a Randian hero. He's a hero in that sort of sense. Yeah. Saakashvili, the president, did a lot of good to kind of protect him and give him the room to do his job. But Kaha was a force of nature, a bulldog. He literally would walk into a government office and fire 90% of the people in one day. He just like, your guys are fired. It was just unbelievable, and I get a little teary-eyed thinking about it because it was just amazing. But the one metaphor for is that we've been using is alcohol and Georgia's wine business, which has been revolutionized. And Georgia has been making wine for literally thousands of years. And even in the Soviet times, the Soviet central planners knew they should grow wine there, and they made bad wine. But since capitalism has come back to Georgia, the Georgian wine business has just flourished, and they have dozens of varieties that don't exist anywhere in the world. They have an old-fashioned style of making wine, and wine snobs, if you're a wine snob, go to Georgia. It is a mecca now. And none of that was possible in Soviet times. I mean, it's the same people, the same land, the same weather. And the Soviet central planners made crappy wine. And you just give them 10 years of economic freedom, and you've got this incredibly innovative wine business going on in Georgia.
Yeah, and it's the wine district there is just, stunningly beautiful. The mountains in the background. And the wine, I'm not a wine snob, so I'm not an expert, but the wine was good. Yeah. Everywhere I went, the wine was good. And the food in Georgia is fantastic. The variety, and they identify the food by each little district from which it comes, and there are big conflicts around this. But it's a fun place because they have this sense about enjoying life. And unfortunately, and I think you mentioned this in the book, that there's still, there's a certain segment in the population still looks at, admires Stalin because he was a Georgian, and there's still this kind of blind nationalism, which is kind of, sad. And
you see that. I mean, the people, I give the people in Gori a little bit of a pass for liking Stalin because he's basically a tourist attraction. I mean, even I've gone to the Stalin Museum and dropped a few dollars behind. And so I suppose if I was a Georgian entrepreneur, that's probably a decent opportunity to make a buck. I don't blame people for doing that, but.
And there's more kids in Georgia that are interested in free markets. The Students for Liberty conferences, they are massive. I get some of my largest audiences when I go speak in Tbilisi, and Ayn Rand's books are translated into Georgian. I mean, it truly is an amazing little country.
And the Georgian government uses the Economic Freedom Index. It's the one you mentioned earlier. There aren't governments that use it. Well, the Georgian government explicitly uses the Economic Freedom Index. And every time I visit Tbilisi, I have meetings, and they're detailed technical meetings. Like, what do we have to do to change this number? And like, what do we have to do to change that number? And they are absolutely serious. They have a government goal to be in the top 10, top 5, actually.
So what's your sense? I mean, you teach young people in the U.S. today, and there's this nutty admiration for socialism among some. I don't think among a majority, because I think a majority doesn't probably care that much about politics. I mean, but it's certainly among a significant number, and maybe, study economics. I don't know if they're better or not. Are they better, the economics students?
Yeah, so I've lost a little touch. I teach MBA students at SMU, and it's $100,000 program. By the time they come to me, I don't have. They're A, pretty competent people, and B, they're not socialists. So it's been a bit more than a decade. But I will say that the scary stuff we see on Fox News about college students and the cancel culture and this or that, I really do think it's pretty grossly exaggerated. I'm a professor. I know literally hundreds of professors around the country, and very few of us have serious problems with freedom of speech on our campuses. And now there aren't as many of us as there should be. I will say we are in the absolute minority.
Sure.
But and we really should have more free market professors of all disciplines. But
and that's how you change the world. You change the world with people, with intellectuals, with professors, other kinds of intellectuals.
Sure, but those of us who are in the business, I'm quite free to do what I want and teach what I want and talk to students about what I want. I realize that's not going to be true at every campus. There are some campuses that are off the rails. They've gone Maoist, but that's not going to be the norm.
Yeah, and so you're optimistic about where the country's heading, or where the future generations of students are heading, or our success in changing the culture?
Yeah, I mean, more or less. I mean, eternal vigilance, right? I mean, we're going to fight the fight against those people who think that they have the magic insight on how to run a society. These people are never going to go away. The next generation is going to have a certain percentage of people that think they're going to know how to run the system, and people younger than you and I are going to have to fight those people off. And it's just an eternal struggle, I think. Mm-hmm. But it's basically a struggle between those who think they know how to run society and those of us who think are humble enough to know that we don't, and that it's really up to us as individuals to figure it all out, working with each other on our businesses and our civil society organizations and whatever. But that's never going to go away. So I'm optimistic in that sense that we're never going to lose, but I'm pessimistic because we're never going to win. Okay. Either. I mean, I got bad news.
I think we will one day. I just think it'll be beyond up times. I think good ideas win out ultimately. So we've got a few super chat questions. Let's see. Somebody asked, in Red Khmer, Cambodia, were there private shops?
So I've never been to Cambodia. I can tell you they're in the Economic Freedom Index, and like China, they've trended upward. They're higher scored than China. In fact, just yesterday I saw a picture of the capital from 30 years ago and one today, and it looks like Shenzhen. I mean, gosh. So they've like Vietnam, Cambodia and like China to a extent, they are nominally still Communist Party run places, but the reality is they're market oriented now, and they're not socialist.
I was in Cambodia, and on the one hand, you get the kind of the worst poverty you can see anywhere in the world: no running water, no electricity, no anything in some places. But in the cities, it's much more like Thailand, or much more like countries that have come out of those extreme poverty, and some of the best hotels in the world. I mean, they know how to treat their tourists, and they're privately run, and I think most of the economy is probably controlled, but privately run. Now, under Khmer, originally in Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, there was probably no private shops, but that's also true that 40% of that population was murdered or died of starvation. So the consequence of literally obliterating all indications of any kind of private property is everybody dies. I mean, that's the consequence. And if the Vietnamese had not invaded, it was funny that the communist Vietnamese invaded Cambodia to free them from the nutty Khmer Rouge, and established an economy which has more private property than they had before. Let's see. Can you own a home in Hong Kong and Singapore I heard you can't really, at least in one of them. How does this affect the ability to use property and attaining credit? Merry Christmas to both of you. All right.
So the Achilles heel in both countries, but especially Hong Kong, is land ownership is primarily owned by the government now, and a lot of the buildings, the residential buildings, not the commercial buildings, but the residential buildings in Hong Kong are government owned. But it's kind of like a condo. You buy your flat, but the building is owned by the government, and it's managed by a private management company. So it's not, and I don't think there's a soft budget constraint either. So that is to say, if you don't make money, the government of Hong Kong doesn't bail you out. You end up getting sold to another private management company who has got a bottom line. So it's a very peculiar sort of, I hate the term public-private partnership, but it's like publicly owned but privately controlled, and with long-term leases. So it's a very weird system. It's not the kind of property market that I would have. And Hong Kong has incredibly large amounts of land that they could build on that the government won't let them build on. So land use restrictions in Hong Kong are just absurd. And that's one of the reasons why Hong Kong is so expensive to live in.
And I think it's the same. I think it might be even worse in Singapore in terms of ownership of condo buildings. I think the government again owns them all. And whereas in some of them are leased, and then there's a whole debate, because Hong Kong's such a young country, relatively speaking, there's a whole debate about what happens when these leases expire.
Right.
Automatically renew, or can the government just take the whole condo? What exactly is going to happen? So there's a lot of uncertainty. When I was in Singapore recently, I've only been there once. There was a lot of people talking about this uncertainty about some deadline was coming up where a lot of these condos were going to be, lease expired, and nobody knew what the government was going to do. And that's never healthy for markets, is when you have that kind of mass uncertainty in the hands of random bureaucrats. All right, thoughts on the French government's strict control over the production of wine in France to keep it within a particular quality and familiarity?
I think it's stupid. We don't have any of that in the United States. And guess what? We have great wine in California in the United States. I mean, they think that they need those controls to have great French wine. That's absurd. They had great French wine before they had those controls. And there's great wine made in other countries that don't have these kinds of controls. The French are mistaken. I mean, what they do is it creates a kind of a cartel situation. Yeah. So it raises prices for the producers, creates rents, as economists call them, for themselves. But it's bad for consumers.
Over the long run, quality would deteriorate as well.
Probably, but I mean, the good news is there's a global market for wine, and if those companies would go out of business if you made bad wine. So,
although the French would subsidize them, I believe. Although Trump is talking about 100% tariffs on French wine now, so to penalize them for something. I don't know. I can't remember what. Somebody wants to know why you're not an objectivist.
Me? Geez, I don't know. I mean, I probably am. Give me another beer and I'll be an objectivist. I'm a 2-beer objectivist. That's it. I mean, I love my Rand. Don't. I got a poster of Atlas Shrugged on my office wall. Don't get me wrong.
Good. I know. There's some that, unless you're carrying it on your, all the time, it's not. Let's see. Isn't it true that Canada's pure government healthcare costs 50% of the tax dollars? Wouldn't that distort Canada's rating on the socialism index? 50% of tax dollars are for government healthcare. I'm not trying to stand the question, but I guess, does healthcare distort the index?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Canadian government, obviously spends a lot of money through the government on healthcare, although the U.S. government does too with Medicare and Medicaid. So
huge amounts.
And so we're probably not much different than Canada on that front. And that draws their score down. There's no question about it. I mean, the flip side, though, is they've got private property. They mostly have unregulated market prices. They have more or less open trade, or at least as open as it gets in this world. Mm-hmm. So they score pretty well. They get a pretty low score. It's like Sweden, Sweden light. They get a low score in government spending and some regulations, but they get a pretty good score. And property rights, money,
Remember where
monetary.
they go? Where do they score?
They're in the top 10. They're
Okay.
right around the, 5 or 6, right around the US.
Yeah. I think when the US dropped to 16, Canada was actually above.
Yeah. But now I think they're just a couple notches below. Yeah.
Let's see. Does freedom of speech, is it part of the index?
So the short answer is no, but one of the reasons we did the index was to actually look at how economic freedom correlated or corresponded with political and civil liberties. So the good news is, in short, the countries that have economic freedom tend to have a lot better scores on political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and things like that. And so that's good. There's no great conflict between economic freedom and political freedoms of different types. It is complicated, though. We have plenty of examples like China, which has trended upward on economic freedom, but really hasn't trended upward on political freedom. So there are kind of oddball countries. And to me, it's one of the most exciting areas of research for academics. If you're interested in freedom of speech, I think we ought to be interested in economic freedom. Maybe you don't care about economic freedom as on its own. Now I do, and I think you do. But if you only cared about economic freedom, I've got a pretty convincing case that I think I can make that says economic freedom is a powerful ingredient that will help deliver freedom of speech to your country, if that's what you care about. Mm-hmm. But it's not in the index.
And there is an index that does kind of social liberties.
Yeah, the most popular is Freedom House does a political rights and civil liberties index. It's 2 indexes, political rights and then civil liberties. And then there's other ones too. There's various democracy indexes, and most of the democracy indexes include aspects like political freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press.
Have you ever looked at the correlation between them?
Oh yeah, it's like 0.8. It's a very high correlation. So
like that. Yep.
It's not perfect though, and actually it's the imperfect parts that are the interesting parts. Is why isn't it perfect? Is the interesting part.
So let's see. How could you deal with government corruption, for instance, in countries like Romania, where privatization occurs and the private sector inherits the corrupt mindset?
Yeah, I think, that was one of the, we didn't talk about this in the book so much, but one of the really interesting things about Georgia's privatization process and contrasting it with what went on in other countries like Romania, Poland, Ukraine especially, is Georgia auctioned off their government-owned assets on open auctions, literally on the internet even. And they were all transparent, and the highest bidder got it. There was none of this shady deals where, friends of the government got the sweetheart deals and stuff like that. And there was none of these voucher plans where, people got vouchers. They traded away these vouchers for a bottle of vodka or something. And then when they realized what they traded away, they had regret. They had sort of seller's regret. So the privatizations were botched in a lot of countries. And I think if we could go back in time, we would probably do a better job of that now, knowing what we know. But Georgia had a little bit of an advantage. They actually went a little bit late.
Yep. And
by the time they got around, they had learned that, man, we just can't give this stuff to our friends. We've got to sell it to the highest bidder. Kaha Bendikidze was adamant that he was selling the stuff for money. Yep. He says, I want the best bid. I don't care if it's a Russian or a Chinese. I don't care. I want money. I'm selling off a hotel. I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder. And because they wanted money to build, fix the roads and, do government.
Unfortunately, the Russians, when they were doing privatization, they didn't come to SMU to ask for advice. They went to Harvard and they got Jeffrey Sachs's advice. Right. And that's what we got. We got the voucher system because an American academic recommended it more than anything else. And that it shaped the whole, future of how Russia evolved. It created the oligarchs. It made it easy for them. It created the gangster kind of mentality of rounding up the vouchers corruptly. And if free market, and I think Georgia not only came late, but also because Kaha understood free markets, he understood the ideas, he did it right. I remember the first time I went to Ukraine, somebody got me which never happens. Somebody got me a meeting in the parliament with some politicians, and they kind of asked me, what could we do? How do we make Ukraine rich? And I basically said, sell everything, privatize everything. And I said, privatize it to the highest bidder. And I said, no matter where they come from. And then maybe you want to exclude the Russians because you're at war with them. But other than that, anybody, Chinese, the Germans, anybody. And they looked at me like I was an alien. They thought, but it's Ukrainian land. It's Ukrainian energy. You gotta shatter this idea of nationalism. Otherwise, you stay poor.
That's right.
There's, the capital exists out there in the world to be invested in these countries if they create the right environment and they and the right incentives. And countries that understand that prosper, and countries that don't are just destroyed. Great. So where can people get the book, find out more about maybe what you do and more about the book?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, the easiest place to find the book is Amazon or any of the usual sellers. Socialism Sucks actually returns a lot of things on Google, but one of them will be the Amazon book. If you see beer on the cover of the book, it's our book.
Yep.
And if you want to know about the Economic Freedom Index, you can go to freetheworld.com, or I work at the O'Neill Center at SMU. It's ONEIL. And if you just type in Economic Freedom Index, you'll probably find our index.
See, here's the thing. Bob told me that when he went on the Mike Levin show, he sold 1,000 copies that day, and it bumped Amazon up to number 5. So I expect no less from my audience.
I'll check the rankings tomorrow. I expect a bump.
Let me know. I wish I had the 2 million listeners. The world would be a different place if that was the case. I'm no Mark Levin, but go buy the book. It's definitely, you'll enjoy it. You'll have fun. And you know what the ideal is? Buy the book and give it to a leftist relative, a young person. I think it's very much written for students. Who will appreciate a lot of the humor. I think we'll all appreciate the humor, particularly students. It's great reading, and they'll get a fantastic economics lesson because there's real economic content through the stories, and people remember stories, right? It's why we all remember Atlas Shrugged. It's because it's a story, and if we can get great ideas through storytelling, we have a chance at being more optimistic than Bob wants to be. All right. Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it. This was fun. And good luck with the book sales and with everything else. And I'll see you,
next conference, wherever. Thanks.
Sometime or some way. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of the Yaron Brook Show. Bye, buddy. Have a great weekend.